In the early 1930s, America was tired, hungry, and afraid. The Great Depression had taken jobs, homes, and hope. Banks failed, families stood in long lines for bread, people listened to radios at night and wondered what tomorrow would steal from them. And in that same time, another kind of fear grew in the shadows. It was the fear of men with guns, fast cars, and cold hearts. They robbed banks. They kidnapped rich people. They crossed state lines like it was nothing. Newspapers called them public enemies. Some people hated them. Some people secretly admired them. But most people feared them. Then a name started spreading across the country like a wildfire, Ma Barker. The name sounded simple, almost harmless. Ma sounded like a mother who cooked meals and cared for her family. But the stories said something else. The stories said Ma Barker was not just a mother. They said she was the boss of a violent gang. They said she planned crimes. They said she ordered kidnappings. They said she stayed calm while her sons pulled guns on innocent people. The public began to picture her as a monster in a dress, a mother who raised criminals and became one herself, a woman who turned her home into a school for outlaws. But here is the truth that makes this story so disturbing. Some historians later questioned the legend. They suggested Ma Barker may not have been the mastermind at all. They suggested she was turned into a symbol because it made a better story. And in a time when people wanted clear villains and clear heroes, the idea of a gangster mother was too powerful to ignore. So the question at the heart of this biography is simple, and it changes everything. Was Ma Barker really the brain behind the Ma Barker Gang? Or was she the person history chose to blame? Her real name was Kate Barker. Most people did not call her Kate. They called her Ma. She was born long before the headlines, long before the FBI and the flashing cameras, long before the word gangster became a brand. She lived in a world where women often had few choices and fewer protections. She did not grow up dreaming of crime. She grew up trying to survive. Kate became a mother, and her life became tied to her children. That is where the story turns. Because her sons did not become famous for honest work, they became known for trouble. And trouble, once it starts, has a way of pulling people in, family included. The Barker sons would later be linked to the group that the public called the Ma Barker Gang. But a more accurate name for the crew was the Barker Karpis Gang. That second name matters, because it points to someone the legend often pushes into the background. Alvin Creepy Karpis. Karpis was not the loudest criminal, but he was one of the smartest. He was careful, patient, and serious. He did not want small robberies that barely paid. He wanted big money. He wanted crimes that changed lives. He wanted control. He also understood something important. A gang needs more than violence. A gang needs plans, hideouts, and people who can keep secrets. In the early 1930s, Karpis linked up with Fred Barker and Arthur Doc Barker. The bond between them was deadly. Fred was known as tough and fearless. Doc was known as reckless and dangerous. Karpis brought structure. Together, they became a team that could hit hard and then disappear. And while the men built the machine, Ma was often nearby. That detail is one reason the legend grew so large. People assumed that if she was there, she must be in charge. People assumed a mother around criminals must be guiding them. In the public mind, it was easier to believe she was the boss than to believe she was simply refusing to leave. But refusing to leave can still have consequences. The gang's crimes did not happen in one dramatic night. They built slowly, like a storm that forms far away. At first, there were robberies and escapes, close calls and whispered deals. The gang needed places to hide, places to sleep, places to plan the next move without police knocking at the door. That is when one city became central to their story. St. Paul, Minnesota, St. Paul, had a strange reputation during that period. It was said that criminals could find safety there for a while, especially if they followed certain rules. Keep quiet, don't cause trouble in town, pay the right people, then move on before the heat gets too high. Whether all the stories about St. Paul were fully true or partly exaggerated, one thing is clear. Many criminals used it as a base, and the Barker Karpis gang was among those who benefited from time and space to regroup. Time is dangerous in the hands of desperate people. Time lets criminals become confident. Time lets them upgrade from robbery to something darker. Because robbery is about money, but kidnapping is about power. And when the Barker Karpis gang moved toward kidnapping, the nation began to pay attention. In a new way. Kidnapping did not feel like a bank being robbed in some far-off town. Kidnapping felt personal. It felt like no one was safe. It felt like the world was turning upside down. At this stage in the story, Mabaka's name began to rise even higher. Newspapers loved the idea of a gangster mother. The image was shocking. It was easy to print. It was easy to remember. It also helped make sense of fear. If the public could place the evil into one clear figure, Ma, then the chaos felt easier to understand. But real life is not always neat. The gang itself was not clean or stable. It was made of shifting loyalties and constant pressure. People came and went. Trust was thin. The law was tightening. The FBI was growing more aggressive. Every crime increased the risk. Every mistake brought the end closer. And inside all of that, Ma Barker's role remained cloudy. Some accounts treated her like a commander. Other accounts treated her like a follower. Some said she was sharp and controlling. Others said she was simply present, living on the run because her sons were living on the run. That uncertainty is what makes a story binge-worthy, because it means the truth is not just about gunfire and money. It is about how stories are built. It is about how legends are sold. It is about how a person can become famous for a role they may not have truly played. In part 1, the name Ma Barker is only the beginning. The country is frightened. The gang is forming. The myth is growing faster than the facts. And the road ahead leads to kidnappings, betrayals, and a violent ending that will be remembered for decades. But before the bullets fly, one question will follow every step they take. Was Ma Barker the mastermind of the Ma Barker gang? Or was she the tragic face of a family that fell apart in public? The legend of Ma Barker did not grow in a single day. It grew step by step, like a shadow that gets longer when the sun goes down. After years of trouble and small crimes, the Barker sons were no longer just local problems. They were becoming part of something bigger, something organized, something that could travel across states and still survive. By the early 1930s, the United States was still choking under the Great Depression. In many towns, honest people struggled to buy food. Meanwhile, the newspapers were full of robberies and gunfights. Some criminals seemed to live like kings, while everyone else lived like they were drowning. That contrast made people angry. It also made people curious. And curiosity is dangerous, because the more people watched these criminals, the more famous they became. Fred Barker was one of the men who learned how to live on the run. He was not known for kindness. He was known for staying calm when others panicked. He could take risks and act fast. His brother, Arthur Doc Barker, was different. Doc was reckless. He was the kind of man who could smile one minute and explode the next. He wanted money, but he also wanted thrills. And thrills make men careless. Then came Alvin Creeby, Karpis. Karpis was not called Creeby because he looked frightening. He was called that because people felt something cold about him. He was quiet and focused. He watched people closely. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, he spoke like someone who already decided what would happen. Karpis did not want to be a small-time robber. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted control. He wanted to plan crimes like a business. When Karpis connected with Fred and Doc Barker, the gang became more than a group of desperate men. It became a machine. Fred could move. Doc could intimidate. Karpis could think. Together, they could hit hard and then vanish. But a machine still needs fuel. Money was fuel. Guns were fuel. Getaway cars were fuel. And something else mattered just as much. Safe places. They needed houses where they could sleep without fear. They needed quiet streets, where neighbors did not ask questions. They needed a city where they could breathe and plan the next step. That is when St. Paul, Minnesota, entered the story. At that time, St. Paul carried a strange reputation. People whispered that criminals could hide there longer than in other cities. Some said local corruption helped them. Some said certain officials were willing to look the other way. Some said there was an unwritten rule. If criminals came to town, they had to stay calm and avoid trouble, and in return, they got time. Whether every rumor was true or not, one thing was clear. St. Paul became a place where criminals often passed through, and many of them found help. It was not a paradise. It was not perfectly safe, but it was safer than most places. For the Barker Karpis crew, that mattered. St. Paul became a place to regroup, a place to meet contacts, a place to hide under fake names, a place to heal after close calls, and in a life where every day might end in prison or death, even a few quiet nights felt like a gift. During this period, Mabaka was often nearby. She moved with her sons. She lived in the same orbit as their danger. She was not always seen holding a gun, but she was seen staying with them, traveling with them, surviving with them. And that presence created a powerful image. People asked, why is she with them? Some answered, because she must be in charge. Others answered, because she cannot leave. And that difference in interpretation would shape her reputation for decades, because the public does not always separate presence from leadership. When people fear something, they want a single face to blame. A mother in a gang becomes a perfect symbol. The idea feels shocking. It feels unnatural. It becomes a story people repeat at dinner tables and in headlines. But inside the gang, daily, life was not a clean story. It was messy, tense, and paranoid. The men trusted each other only as long as it helped them live. They argued about money. They argued about risk. They argued about who was being careless. Each member knew that one wrong move could bring police. Through the door, they also knew something else. The law was changing. In the past, criminals could often stay within one state and confuse local police. But now, federal power was stronger. The FBI was growing. Crossing state lines no longer meant freedom. It meant a bigger chase. That chase created pressure, and pressure pushed the gang toward bigger crimes. Small robberies were no longer enough. Small robberies kept the gang hungry. Hungry men take risks. And when criminals take bigger risks, they begin to justify worse actions. At night, the gang talked about money like it was air. They needed it to breathe. They needed it to stay ahead of the law. They needed it to keep living as fugitives. And then the idea surfaced, like a dark thought that refuses to go away. Kidnapping. Kidnapping was different from robbery. Robbery lasted minutes. Kidnapping could last days. Robbery could go wrong quickly, but kidnapping could go wrong slowly. And in a more terrifying way, kidnapping also brought bigger payouts. It allowed criminals to target wealthy people and demand ransoms that could keep a gang alive for months or years. But kidnapping carried a new type of danger. It brought national anger. It brought pressure from powerful families. It brought newspaper storms. And it brought the kind of attention that made hiding almost impossible. This is where the gang began to split inside. Some members leaned toward the idea. Some hesitated. Some worried that kidnapping would turn the whole country against them. Others believed the country was already against them. And it did not matter. Karpis, with his cold focus, understood the math. Bigger crimes meant bigger money. Bigger money meant more time. And time, for criminals, felt like victory. Fred Barker, hardened by years of running, was not the type to step back. If the gang moved forward, he would move forward. Doc Barker was hungry for excitement and careless with consequences. For him, kidnapping did not sound like a line that should not be crossed. It sounded like an upgrade, and Ma Barker remained in the background of this decision, like a figure standing in a doorway while a storm forms outside. She was present, but her true influence was unclear. She did not leave. She did not disappear. She stayed near the men who were choosing the next step. That is the moment the story begins to turn from criminal life to national nightmare. Because once kidnapping becomes part of the plan, the gang is no longer just stealing money. They are stealing safety. They are stealing peace of mind. They are telling every wealthy family in America, you could be next. And when fear spreads, the government responds. By the time the Barker Karpis crew began talking seriously about kidnapping, they were already living like hunted men. Every town felt temporary. Every hotel room felt dangerous. Every strange car parked nearby felt like the end. They were not building a future. They were buying time. Robbery had kept them alive, but robbery also kept them exposed. Banks increased. Security, police communication improved. Witnesses talked. Getaway routes became predictable. The gang needed a crime that paid more with fewer jobs. That is how kidnapping became the plan. For a gang like this, kidnapping was not only about money, it was about control. A bank could resist, a guard could shoot back, but a kidnapped man in a hidden room could not do much except wait and hope. Still, kidnapping was risky. It required planning, discipline, and silence. It required places to hide a person. It required strict rules inside the crew. One careless word could destroy everything. Alvin Creepy Karpis understood all of that. He was the planner. He treated crime like a cold project. He believed that if the gang followed a clear process, they could win. Fred Barker agreed because Fred believed in action and loyalty. Doc Barker agreed because Doc wanted excitement and big money. The crew moved forward, and while the men pushed toward the next step, Ma Barker stayed near them, traveling when they traveled, living where they lived. People on the outside would later use that detail as proof that she ran the gang. But the truth was not that simple. No one could fully prove what she ordered or what she did not. What could be proven was that she remained part of the gang's world close enough that when the headlines exploded, her name would explode with them. The crew needed a target. A kidnapping target had to fit a strict list. The person had to be valuable enough for a ransom. The person had to have a family with access to money. The person had to be reachable, meaning the gang could grab him without an immediate shootout. An immediate shootout. And the person had to be taken to a place where he could be held without neighbors noticing. In the early summer of 1933, the gang fixed its eyes on William Hamm Jr., a wealthy man connected to a powerful brewing family. He was exactly the kind of target that criminals dreamed about and families feared. The decision was made, and once it was made, there was no safe way back. The kidnapping did not happen like it does in movies, with dramatic speeches and perfect timing. It happened with the sudden speed of violence. One moment a man was living a normal day. The next moment he was surrounded by strangers with guns and forced into a car to the victim. The world changed in seconds. Hamm was pulled away from his life and pushed into a hidden nightmare. The gang moved him between secret locations, keeping him blind to where he was. They did not want him to recognize roads, buildings, or voices. They did not want him to become evidence. They wanted him to be an object, valuable, silent, controlled. For the gang, the hardest part was not the grabbing. The hardest part was the holding. When a person is held for ransom, every hour creates new dangers. A victim might get sick. The victim might resist. Neighbors might notice strange sounds. A single gang member might panic and make a mistake. Police might trace phone calls. A ransom message might fall into the wrong hands. Kidnapping forces criminals to live inside their own fear. As Hamm waited in captivity, his family faced the kind of choice that makes people feel helpless. Pay and hope he comes back alive. Refuse and risk losing him forever. The gang demanded an enormous sum money that could keep fugitives running for a long time. The family paid. When Hamm was released, it seemed like the gang had won. They got the money, the victim lived. No major shootout happened. From a criminal point of view, it looked like a successful operation, but success in kidnapping carries poison inside it, because kidnapping draws attention like fire draws smoke. Even if the gang escaped that moment, the country did not forget. Federal agencies did not forget. Newspapers did not forget. Wealthy families did not forget. After the Hamm kidnapping, the Barker Karpis gang was no longer just another crew of robbers. They became national figures. They became the kind of criminals that politicians talked about and lawmen promised to hunt. And once a gang becomes that kind of symbol, the chase becomes personal. The FBI and other law enforcement groups began tightening their net. They studied patterns. They watched known associates. They listened for whispers in the underworld. They offered deals to informants. They pushed pressure onto anyone connected to the gang. The gang felt that pressure like a hand around its throat. They moved more. They trusted less. They watched every stranger. They kept their guns closer. And during this period, my Barker's legend began to form in a more aggressive way. The public did not just want criminals. The public wanted characters. They wanted the bold gangster. They wanted the cold-planer. They wanted the reckless shooter. And they wanted the shocking figure that made the story unforgettable. A mother, a ma, a woman tied to violent men, traveling with them, living in their circles. To many people, it did not matter what Ma Barker truly did or did not do. Her presence created a story that felt bigger than life. It was easier for the public to believe. She was a mastermind because that idea made the gang seem even more terrifying. It also made the story simpler. A gang with a boss is easier to understand than a gang full of shifting power and messy decisions. But inside the gang, the mood was not simple. It was unstable. The Hamm money helped, but it did not bring peace. It did not bring safety. It brought confidence, and confidence often leads to greater danger. The gang began to believe they could repeat the success. They began to believe they could do another kidnapping, maybe even bigger. Karpis likely saw the next step clearly. One big ransom could keep them alive, but two could build a future. Fred likely believed in moving forward because backing out felt like weakness. Doc likely wanted the thrill and the status. And Ma Barker remained near, living inside their chaos, whether by choice, loyalty, fear, or all of it combined. The Hamm kidnapping was the gang's first major leap into a new level of crime. It proved what they could do. It also proved what the country would do in response, because after Hamm, the law was no longer chasing random criminals. It was chasing a symbol of national fear. After the Hamm kidnapping, the Barker Karpis gang did not celebrate like movie villains. They did not relax. They did not believe the danger was over. In fact, the money only bought them one thing: time, and time for hunted people can feel like both a gift and a curse. The ransom money gave the gang food, cars, weapons, and places to hide, but it also placed a bright spotlight on their names. The country now knew what they were capable of. Newspapers repeated the details again and again. Citizens talked about it at work, in restaurants, and on front porches. Police departments traded information. Federal agents pushed harder. The gang could feel the hunt tightening. They moved like people who slept with one eye open. They avoided habits. They changed locations quickly. They used fake names. They watched mirrors and windows. They distrusted strangers, and they distrusted friends even more. Every knock on a door sounded like prison. Every engine outside sounded like death. In the middle of this, they returned to a place that felt familiar. St. Paul, Minnesota. That St. Paul had become more than a city in their story. It was a tool, a resting place, a rumor that criminals could breathe there longer than they could breathe elsewhere. Some said the city had corruption. Some said certain criminals had deals. Some said there were quiet arrangements that bought time. The truth was complicated, but criminals did not need perfection. They only needed a small advantage. For the Barker Karpis Gang, St. Paul offered that advantage. It offered connections. It offered housing under fake names. It offered people who asked fewer questions, as long as the gang stayed calm and paid what was expected. But safe does not mean safe forever. After Hamm, St. Paul was not just a hideout. It was also a trap waiting to close. Because the more criminals used it, the more lawmen watched it. The more whispers spread, the more pressure grew. Still, the gang came back, because they had few other choices. And while the men planned their moves, Ma Barker remained nearby, still in the same orbit as her sons. She was a mother traveling with fugitives, sharing their fear, living inside their unstable world. To the public, that fact alone sounded evil. To many historians later, it sounded complicated. Because mothers do not always leave when they should. Sometimes they stay because they cannot accept what has happened. Sometimes they stay because they think their presence can protect their children. Sometimes they stay because leaving feels like betrayal. No one could easily measure Ma's true role. What could be seen was her proximity to the gang's life. And that proximity would keep feeding the legend inside the crew. The pressure created arguments. Some members wanted to slow down. They had money now. They could try to hide and survive quietly for a while. Others believed slowing down was impossible. They thought the law would catch them sooner or later, so it was better to strike again and build bigger distance. Alvin. Karpis was the kind of criminal who believed in control. He believed the gang should act, not wait. Waiting made men careless. Waiting made allies talk. Waiting made the law stronger. Fred Barker trusted Karpis's thinking because Fred valued survival and loyalty. Fred also understood a hard truth. Once a gang becomes famous, it has trouble returning to small crimes. The risk stays high, even when the money becomes low. Doc Barker was restless. He did not want quiet hiding. He wanted movement. He wanted excitement. He wanted to feel powerful. Men like Doc often push groups toward disaster because they confused danger with strength. This mix created a dangerous balance. One calm planner, one tough enforcer, one reckless risk-taker, and around them a tight circle of associates who came and went, each one a possible weak link. Then a new idea began to rise. Another kidnapping. The first kidnapping had worked. The gang had forced a rich family to pay. They had proven they could control the situation for days. They had collected money that most honest workers could not earn in a lifetime. But success in crime is like a drug. It changes how criminals think. It makes them believe the world can be pushed around. It makes them believe they can repeat the when. Karpis understood that one ransom could keep them alive, but another could make them secure for much longer. He also understood something darker. After the first kidnapping, the gang was already on the federal radar. The danger level was already high. To him, that meant there was less reason to stay cautious. If they were going to be hunted anyway, they might as well be rich. But kidnapping also required the right target. The gang needed someone worth enough money to justify the risk. They needed a person whose family could pay quickly. They needed a target close enough to grab, and a city environment they understood. St. Paul, again, became central. St. Paul lived the kind of man the gang wanted. Edward Bremer, a wealthy businessman, with a well-known family and strong connections. Bremer was the kind of person people believed would never be touched by street crime. That is why criminals like Karpis found him appealing. It was not only money, it was power. It was the message. If they could take someone like Bremer, they could take anyone. The gang began studying the target's routine. They watched patterns. They noted times, locations, habits. They considered how to move him quickly without a public gunfight. They planned where to hold him. They prepared how to communicate and collect the ransom. And as these plans formed, paranoia grew inside the crew, because the gang knew the law was watching St. Paul. They knew informants existed. They knew phone lines could be traced. They knew rumors traveled fast. One wrong step could bring federal agents crashing into their world. This is where the safe haven began to feel less safe. The streets looked normal during the day. People walked to work. Cars drove by. Stores opened and closed. But to the gang, everything felt suspicious. A man standing too long on a corner felt like surveillance. A car that slowed down felt like a tail. A neighbor who smiled too much felt like a threat. And pressure changes people. It makes criminals sharper. But it also makes them more likely to make a mistake. It makes them turn on each other. It makes them imagine betrayal everywhere. It turns simple problems into panic. My Barker was living inside this same pressure. Even if she did not plan crimes, she lived among men who did. She heard the arguments, she saw the tension, she felt the fear, and she stayed to some. That stain looked like guilt. To others, it looked like loyalty. But either way, it kept tying her name tighter to the gang's identity. By late 1933 and early 1934, the plan around Bremer began to harden into action. The gang had selected their target. They had prepared their methods. They had accepted the risk. At this point, they were no longer debating whether they would become kidnappers again. They already were. In January 1934, the Barker Karpis gang was no longer guessing what they could do. They had already taken one. Rich man had gotten paid. They had survived the heat that followed. They had hidden, moved, and stayed alive. That survival fed a dangerous belief. If it worked once, it could work again. St. Paul, Minnesota, was still the center of their world. It was the city they understood. It was the city where they had contacts, hiding places, and experience. But St. Paul was also where the law was watching more closely than ever. That did not stop them. The gang's next target was Edward Bremer. A wealthy man from a well-known family, he moved through the city like someone who believed the rules of society protected him. He had money, status, and connections. People like him were supposed to be safe, but the Great Depression had changed the country. It had changed what criminals dared to do, and it had changed what safety meant. The gang watched Bremer's routine carefully. They did not want chaos. They wanted control. The plan had to be fast. Bremer had to be taken in a moment when the public could not stop it and the police could not react in time. On the day it happened, St. Paul looked normal. Cars rolled down the streets. People walked with their heads down against the cold. Business continued like it always did. But under that normal surface, a trap was forming. Bremer stepped outside, thinking it was just another day. Then a car moved into position. Men stepped out. A gun appeared. Words were short. The moment was sharp and terrifying. Bremer was forced into the vehicle and driven away. It happened so quickly that the city barely understood it at first. Then the reality hit. A wealthy man had been kidnapped in broad daylight. The gang moved Bremer to a hidden location. They kept him away from windows. They controlled what he ate, when he slept, when he spoke, when he stayed silent. They did not treat him like a person with a life and family. They treated him like a package worth money. But the gang also knew something important. A kidnapped man is not only a hostage, he is also a risk. If Bremer got sick or injured, the gang could lose everything. If he escaped, they would be hunted down faster. If he recognized places or heard important details, he could later identify them. Every day he stayed alive and aware made him more dangerous to them. So the gang worked hard to keep him disoriented. Meanwhile, the gang made their demand. They wanted $200, in the early 1930s. That amount was massive. It was the kind of money that could change a criminal's life forever. It was also the kind of demand that made the public feel helpless. If the gang could do this and get away with it, what would stop others? The ransom demand spread through St. Paul, then across the country. People discussed it on the radio. Newspapers printed details, sometimes with dramatic language, sometimes with panic. The story became bigger than the victim. It became a symbol. The message was simple and frightening. No one was untouchable, and in that growing storm, the name Ma Barker rose even higher. People loved the idea of a gangster mother because it made the story feel even more shocking. The public could not stop imagining it. A mother connected to kidnappers did not match the world people wanted to believe in. It felt like a moral collapse, like the family itself had become dangerous. Some reports suggested Ma was with the gang during this period. She was seen around her sons. She lived near the criminal life they created. That was enough for the legend to expand again. And with every repeat of the legend, Ma Barker became less like a real woman and more like a character. A villain, a brand. But inside the gang, there was no feeling of fame. There was only pressure. Kidnapping a slow terror for everyone involved. Bremer lived each day not knowing if he would be released or killed. The family lived in fear, trying to raise money and follow instructions without making a mistake. The police lived in frustration, wanting to act but fearing they might get the hostage killed, and the gang lived in paranoia. They knew the Bremer kidnapping had brought attention that was even heavier than the Hamm case. They knew the FBI was watching. They knew the city was full of quiet eyes. They knew that if a single part of their process failed, they would not walk away. Even a simple phone call became dangerous. Any communication could be traced. Any messenger could be followed. Any location connected to the ransom could lead law enforcement straight back to the gang. So the gang tried to be careful. They used coded messages and strict instructions. They attempted to control every detail like a machine controlling its parts. But machines can break, especially when humans are the parts. Within the gang, tension grew. Long operations create long nerves. A member might argue about the next step. Another might worry about betrayal. Someone might push to move the hostage. Another might insist to keep him in one place. Fear changes the mind. It turns allies into suspects. Yet, despite the pressure, the ransom was arranged. The family, desperate to save Bremer, prepared the money. The handoff was approached with extreme care. The gang did not want a trap. The family did not want the gang to panic. The police wanted results, but could not fully control the situation. In the end, the money was delivered, and Bremer was released. When he returned, the city exhaled. For the family, the return was a miracle. For the public, it was a shock. For the gang, it was another victory. But it was the kind of victory that causes collapse later, because now the gang had done it twice. They had taken two wealthy men and collected huge ransoms. They were no longer criminals hiding in the dark corners of the country. They were national targets, and the law responded accordingly. After Bremer, the pressure became relentless. Law enforcement dug deeper. They interrogated suspects. They followed money trails. They hunted down safe houses. They leaned on informants. They listened for any whisper connected to the gang. The public story also changed. The gang's name was now fully tied to Ma Barker in popular culture, whether she deserved it or not. The mother of outlaws idea became the hook that kept people reading. It made the gang feel even more unnatural, even more threatening, and that public obsession mattered because it shaped how the government and the media presented the chase. The hunt became a dramatic, national story with heroes and villains, with a clear bad guy image. After Edward Bremer was released, the Barker Karpis Gang had the money they wanted. On paper, they had won. 2 major kidnappings, 2 massive ransoms, 2 escapes. But real life does not reward criminals with peace. It rewards them with attention. And attention is a kind of cage. In the weeks after the Bremer kidnapping, the country did not calm down. It became louder. Newspapers repeated the story like it was a warning siren. Radio reports pushed the fear into living rooms. People who had never been to St. Paul began saying the city's name like it was a crime scene. Law enforcement felt embarrassed, Rich families felt exposed. Ordinary citizens felt unsafe. And when enough people feel unsafe at the same time, the government reacts with force. The pressure became heavy and constant. Federal agents and local police began working harder, not just to find the gang, but to prove that the law still mattered. They studied patterns from the Hamm and Bremer cases. They looked for repeat habits. They compared witness details. They tracked possible hideouts and known contacts. They watched for anyone spending large amounts of money too fast. They also hunted the weak links, because a gang like this does not survive alone. It survives through helpers, people who rent rooms, lend cars, sell weapons, deliver messages, and keep secrets. Some helpers do it for money. Some do it for fear. Some do it because they think criminals are exciting, but helpers break when the pressure rises. A helper gets arrested for something small, and suddenly a deal is offered. Talk and walk free, or stay silent and go to prison. A helper gets scared, and suddenly loyalty feels stupid. A helper starts thinking about family, and suddenly the gang feels like poison. This is how the walls close in, not with one big action, but with many small cracks. Inside the Barker Karpis gang, the mood changed. The money was there, but the confidence was not. The kidnappings had brought them into the brightest spotlight of their lives. Every road felt watched. Every stranger felt dangerous. Every room felt temporary. They started living like ghosts. They moved again and again, changing locations quickly. They kept conversations short. They avoided crowds. They slept with weapons near their hands. They trusted less, even within their own circle. And while the men struggled with this pressure, Ma Barker remained near them. That detail mattered more than ever, because the more famous the gang became, the more people wanted a clear story. The public wanted a boss. The public wanted a single villain to blame. The public wanted something shocking enough to explain the fear they felt. A gangster mother became the perfect symbol, so the legend grew. Some people claimed Ma Barker controlled her sons. Some claimed she planned operations. Some claimed she was the comm center of the gang, the one who made decisions when the men argued. But others questioned that story. They asked a different question. If Ma was truly the mastermind, why did the gang's actions often seem messy and risky? Why did they move like men under pressure, not like a perfect criminal machine? Why did they make choices that increased danger instead of reducing it? Those questions did not have easy answers. And that uncertainty made the story even more powerful. Because if Ma Barker was not the mastermind, then what was she? A loyal mother who refused to leave? A person who benefited from crime without leading it? A woman trapped by her son's choices? Or a criminal partner who simply kept her role quiet? No one could easily prove it fully. What could be seen was this: she stayed close enough to become part of the gang's identity. And once that happened, the world would not separate her from the violence. Meanwhile, Alvin Creepy Karpis focused on survival. He had always been the planner, the one who wanted control. But now he faced a problem that planning could not fully solve. The gang was becoming too famous. Karpis could plan a kidnapping with steps and rules, but he could not plan the public's obsession. He could not plan the government's need to win. He could not plan the way fear made people talk. And when people start talking, secrecy dies. Fred Barker handled pressure with toughness. He was not the type to cry or complain. He believed fear was weakness. But even tough men crack when the walls keep closing and there is nowhere to run. Doc Barker, on the other hand, became more dangerous under pressure. He was restless. He wanted to act. He wanted to hit again. He wanted to feel powerful instead of hunted. But acting again was exactly what could destroy them. This created conflict inside the group. One side wanted to slow down and hide. The other side wanted to strike again to prove they were still in control. And every argument carried an unspoken threat. If the gang split, the risk of betrayal would explode, because when criminals split, someone always talks. The gang began arguing about money as well. Big ransom money does not bring unity. It brings jealousy. One man thinks he deserves more. Another thinks someone is being wasteful. Another suspects someone is stealing. Another fears someone might run off alone. Under pressure, small issues become big fights. Then something even darker began to grow. The fear of informants. The gang started asking who has been followed, who has been seen, who can't be trusted. They began checking each other's stories. They watched each other's faces during conversations. They became suspicious of anyone who seemed calm, because calm can look like guilt. In this period, law enforcement began catching people around the gang. Not always the main figures, but the circle that kept them alive. A person connected to a safe house gets questioned. A messenger gets stopped. A small criminal gets arrested and decides to trade names for freedom. The gang felt the squeeze. They understood that even if they avoided the police might reach them through everyone else. This is when the emotional turn in the story becomes clear. The gang had become what the public feared most, but they were also becoming what criminals fear most: isolated. They could not trust outsiders. They could not trust friends. They could barely trust each other. And Ma Barka, surrounded by this suspicion and movement, was no longer just a mother. Near trouble. She was living inside a storm where any wrong move could end in a grave. For a moment, the gang tried to hold on to what worked before. They tried to use familiar places, familiar contacts, familiar routines, but the world had changed. After Bremer, the safe haven feeling around St. Paul weakened. The city was hotter, eyes were sharper, the margin for error was smaller. The gang needed distance and quiet, so they began thinking about leaving the center of the heat. They looked toward places where they could blend in, where people might not recognize them as quickly, where law enforcement might not expect them. That is how the idea of Florida and other southern hideouts became appealing. It was not about comfort. It was about space. It was about breathing room. But even that plan carried danger, because moving a gang across long distances creates exposure. Cars break down. People get seen. Motel staff remember faces. Gas station attendants talk. A single traffic stop can become a disaster. Still, the gang felt they had no choice. Staying close to St. Paul felt like waiting to be caught. Leaving felt risky, but staying felt like death. After the Bremer kidnapping, the Barker Karpis gang was still alive, but it was no longer steady. The money was there, yet the pressure was heavier than ever. Their names were no longer whispers. They were headlines. And a headline does not disappear just because criminals change hotels or drive to a new town. Law enforcement now treated the Barker Karpis gang like a top priority. Agents and police were not only chasing the main members, they were chasing the entire circle around them. Every friend, every helper, every rented room, every contact who once felt safe now felt like a risk. The gang felt it too. They stopped moving like confident criminals. They started moving like cornered animals. They argued more. They trusted less. They slept less. They watched every street and every stranger. Each member feared the same thing. Not just arrest, but betrayal. Because a gang does not fall only from bullets. It often falls from one person talking at the wrong time. Alvin, creepy Karpis, stayed focused on survival. He had always been careful, but now he was colder. He knew that the longer the gang stayed together, the easier it was for the law to track them. But he also knew that splitting up could be deadly, because separate criminals make separate mistakes. Fred Barker became even more serious. He was tough, but even tough men grow tired. He understood that the gang had crossed a line with kidnapping. They could not go back to small crimes and quiet lives. Their faces were known. Their names were on lists. The chase would not stop. Arthur Doc Barker, meanwhile, became a problem that grew larger every day. Doc was reckless under normal conditions. Under pressure, his recklessness became dangerous. A careless decision could expose them all. A loud argument could draw attention. A flashy move could create witnesses, and witnesses were now the gang's greatest enemy. Then, in early 1935, the blow arrived. Doc Barker was arrested. To the public, it was a victory. It looked like the beginning of the end. To the gang, it felt like the floor breaking beneath them. Doc was not only a gang member, he was family to Fred. He was also a person who knew too much. If the law pushed him hard enough, could he hold the line? That question haunted the gang like a shadow. Because once one major member is captured, every other member becomes easier to catch. The police learn habits, they learn favorite hideouts, they learn names of helpers. Even if the arrested man does not speak, his capture creates chaos, and chaos creates mistakes. After Doc's arrest, the gang's world got smaller overnight. Places they once trusted became unsafe, old contacts became risks, old routines became traps. The gang could not simply hide in familiar corners anymore. They needed distance. They needed a place where people did not expect them. So, the focus shifted south. Florida. Florida offered what many fugitives dream of: space, warm weather, and the chance to blend into new crowds. It also had small towns and quiet roads, places where strangers could rent a house and keep to themselves without too many questions. For Ma Barker and Fred Barker, Florida became the next move. This is where the story becomes darker and more complicated. Ma Barker was still there, still tied to the gang's life. She was older than the men, and she did not move like a gunman in a movie. Yet she was present, living beside fugitives. That alone kept the legend alive. The public could not accept a simple picture of a mother who stayed too close to her sons. People wanted a stronger reason. They wanted a villain. So the myth continued to grow. Ma Barker, the gang boss, the mastermind, the mother of outlaws. But the real situation was not glamorous. It was tense, tired, and uncertain. A life on the run is not a life of constant power. It is a life of constant fear. In Florida, Ma and Fred settled into a rented place near Lake Weir, in the area around Ocklawaha. To them, it likely felt like a pause. A chance to breathe, a chance to stay still long enough to plan, a chance to let the heat cool down. But the heat does not cool down when the federal government is involved. The FBI was tracking the gang with growing urgency. Agents followed leads, watched known connections, and pushed on any weak points they could find. They were not guessing anymore. They were building a picture piece by piece, and piece by piece, that picture began pointing toward Florida. Ma and Fred were trying to stay quiet, but quiet does not erase the past. A rental has paperwork. A purchase leaves a trail. A visitor can be noticed. A conversation can be overheard. Even small choices can become signals when law enforcement is already looking. This is the cruel truth of being a fugitive. The longer someone runs, the more chances there are for something small to go wrong. A single moment can do it. A name spoken too loudly, a face recognized, a car remembered, a neighbor who grows curious, a person who wants reward money, and once law enforcement believes it has a real location, it does not approach carefully like a polite visitor. It approaches like a storm. The final days before the confrontation were filled with invisible tension. The public did not see it, but the danger was forming. Agents moved closer. Plans were made. Backup was arranged. The goal was to trap the fugitives with no clean exit. Inside the house, Ma and Fred likely sensed the same thing many criminals sense near the end. The air changes. The world feels too quiet. And the silence feels heavy. Small sounds feel louder than they should. And sleep feels impossible. Whether they believed the law was near or not, they were still living like people who expected trouble. Weapons were close. Bags could be ready. A fast escape might have been discussed, but escape is not always possible when the net is already around you. And now, Barker's story reached its most controversial point. If she was truly the gang's mastermind, then this was her last stand as a criminal leader. If she was not, then this was the last stand of a mother who stayed with her son until the final moment. That question hangs over everything that follows. By the time agents surrounded the house near Lake Weir, the story was already larger than life. It was no longer only about crime, it was about myth. It was about fear. It was about a nation that wanted a clear ending, and the ending was coming. By the time Ma Barker and Fred Barker reached Florida, they were not living like free people. They were living like fugitives who knew the road was running out. They had crossed state lines to find quiet, but quiet did not mean safe. It only meant fewer eyes until the wrong eyes appeared. They rented a small place near Lake Weir, close to Ocklawaha. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary house in a peaceful area. Trees, dirt roads, a calm, open sky. It was the kind of place where people expected fishing stories and slow mornings. Not gunmen and federal agents. Inside, nothing felt peaceful. Fred Barker was still the same man, hard alert and ready. He had been hunted for years and knew how quickly life could end. Ma Barker was older and carried the weight of a long, troubled journey. Whether she was a planner or simply present, she was now tied to the gang's fate. There was no clean way out. There was only the next day and the day after that, until something broke, and something was about to break. Outside the house, law enforcement was not guessing anymore. The hunt had sharpened into a target, leads had been followed, trails had been pulled tight. Agents believed they had finally found Ma and Fred. The plan was not to ask questions from the driveway. The plan was to prevent escape. The pressure was silent at first. Cars appeared in the area. Men moved carefully. They watched the house from a distance. They checked positions. They made sure the net was placed correctly, like fishermen preparing for the final pull. The goal was simple: surround the house, cut off exit paths, and force a surrender. But criminals like Fred Barker did not trust surrender. To men who had spent years running, surrender could feel like a slow death. Prison, humiliation, separation, no control. And in that mindset, even a hopeless fight can feel like the only choice left. The morning arrived, and the moment came. Agents approached, and the calm outside shattered. Gunfire began. It did not begin like a heroic scene. It began like panic and fear colliding. Loud cracks, sharp echoes, splinters of wood, bullets tearing through walls that were never built to hold back war-level force. The small house became a violent box, and everyone in and around it knew one truth at the same time. This could end in seconds, but it did not end in seconds. It dragged on for hours. The standoff became a long, tense nightmare. The agents kept calling for surrender. The people inside did not come out. Shots continued, the air filled with noise and danger, and the longer it lasted, the worse it became for everyone. Because time is not neutral in a gunfight. Time brings exhaustion. Time brings mistakes. Time increases the chance that someone will die who never needed to. Neighbors in the area would later remember the sounds and the fear. A quiet place became the center of a national storm. People who had no connection to the gang were suddenly connected by a terrifying experience. Hearing a battle unfold near their homes, inside the house, Ma and Fred were trapped. There were no safe exits, no secret tunnels, no miracle ride waiting on the road. The house was surrounded, and every window became a risk. Every movement became a gamble. This is where the legend of Ma Barker hardened in the public mind. To the public, the story sounded shocking. A mother and her son in a final gunfight against federal agents. Newspapers and officials would describe it in ways that made it feel like a last stand of evil. People wanted the image to be dramatic, because drama sells, and in the 1930s, the country was hungry for stories that felt like clear endings. But inside that house, it was not a clean story. It was fear. It was the fear of being caught. It was the fear of being killed. It was the fear of what would happen if they gave up, and it was also the fear of being remembered forever in the worst possible way. Because fame is not always a reward. Sometimes fame is a curse that follows a person even after death. As the hours passed, the situation became more desperate. The house took damage, the air grew thick, the line between holding out and hopeless became thin. The agents outside could not simply walk away. They were committed. They also had to avoid unnecessary casualties. And this is an important truth often lost in crime legends. When law enforcement surrounds a house, the goal is not a movie scene. The goal is control. The goal is to stop future harm. The goal is to end the threat with as little bloodshed as possible. But in a tense standoff, control is never perfect. Eventually, the gunfire slowed. Then it stopped. When agents finally entered, they found the end of the road. Ma Barker was dead. Fred Barker was dead. The chase that had stretched across states, crimes, and headlines had reached its final page in that small Florida house. And once the smoke cleared, the country received its ending, at least the version of the ending it could understand. For the FBI and law enforcement, it was a victory against dangerous criminals. It was proof that the government could catch even the most feared fugitives. It was a message to other gangs. Running would not last forever. For the public, it was a shocking story that felt almost unreal. A mother and son dead in a shootout. A gang ending in a quiet place. It was the kind of story people repeated because it carried a strange mix of horror and fascination. But for the truth, the ending created new confusion. Because the moment Ma Barker died, she became even harder to understand. Dead people cannot explain themselves. Dead people cannot defend themselves. Dead people cannot correct the story. So the myth grew larger. Some said Ma Barker died like a fearless criminal leader. Some said she was the gang's brain until the last breath. Some insisted she was just a mother who followed her sons and paid the final price. And that argument mattered because it shaped how the public remembered her. If Ma was the mastermind, then her death was the fall of a criminal queen. If she was not, then her death was the last scene of a family tragedy that became national entertainment. Either way, the house near Lake Ware became a symbol. It symbolized the end of the Barker era fear. It symbolized the power of the federal hunt. And it symbolized how quickly a person can be turned into a legend sometimes, without clear proof. But the story was not fully over yet, because one key figure was still out there. Alvin Creepy. Karpis had not been in that house. He was still running. And as long as he was free, the Barker Karpis story did not have a complete ending. When the shootout near Lake Ware ended, the country felt like it had reached the finish line. Ma Barker was dead. Fred Barker was dead. A small Florida house had become the final picture in a long chase. Newspapers had their ending. Law enforcement had its victory. The public had its dramatic headline. But the truth was this. The gang's story was not fully finished, because Alvin Creeper Karpis was still free, and as long as he was moving, the fear could not completely fade. Karpis had always been different. From the others, Fred Barker was tough and direct. Doc Barker was reckless and unstable. But Karpis was calculated. He did not rely on anger or luck. He relied on planning, patience, and control. He thought about crime the way some men think about business. That is why he survived longer than most. After the death of Ma and Fred, Karpis understood something important. The government would now push even harder to catch him. The public would demand it. Law enforcement would need it. The FBI would want the final name checked off the list, so Karpis did what he had done for years. He ran, but running is not simply driving away. It is a daily strategy. It is constant decision-making. It is always asking, what does the law expect me to do? And then doing the opposite, Karpis changed locations often. He avoided old contacts who might be watched. He limited who he spoke to. He stayed alert for tales. He tried to live like a man with no past and no future, only the present moment. That kind of life destroys the mind slowly. It creates loneliness. It creates paranoia. It creates the feeling that every stranger could be the end. Even when a fugitive finds a quiet place, his heart does not rest. He sleeps lightly. He listens for footsteps. He watches for car doors. He scans faces. Karpis was skilled at this. But skill does not make someone invisible forever. The FBI was studying him the way hunters study a clever animal. They looked at patterns. They looked at known relationships. They watched for spending, travel, and movement. They checked rumors in the criminal world. They leaned on informants. They followed any lead, even weak ones, because weak leads sometimes become strong when combined. Time was turning against him, and the longer Karpis stayed free, the more the public story around Ma Barker grew. This is where the story becomes strange and powerful, because once Ma and Fred were dead, Ma Barker could no longer speak, and the public could turn her into anything it wanted. In many accounts, Ma was presented as the gang's leader, the brain behind kidnappings, the planner behind robberies, the mother who controlled. Her sons like soldiers. It made a perfect narrative. It shocked people. It sold papers. It gave the country a villain that felt different from the usual gangsta. And it made the gang's story feel like a twisted family drama. Not just criminal activity, but historians and researchers continued to raise doubts. They pointed out that the Barker Karpis gang's biggest operation showed the signs of careful criminal planning, but not necessarily the signs of a mother directing men in the field. They noted that Karpis himself was a strategic thinker, and Fred Barker was fully capable of violent leadership. They argued that the Ma Barker mastermind image may have been exaggerated, possibly by the same forces that wanted a simple and dramatic public story. This is not a small detail, because it changes how people understand Ma Barker's life and death. If Ma Barker truly was the mastermind, then she was one of the most unusual crime leaders of her time. She would be a rare figure, a woman running a major gang during a period dominated by male criminals. Her story would be one of hidden power and ruthless control. But if Ma Barker was not the mastermind, then her story becomes something else entirely. It becomes the story of how a mother can be pulled into disaster. It becomes the story of how loyalty can turn into a cage. It becomes a story of how society can turn a person into a symbol and then refuse to let that symbol go. Either way, Ma Barker became bigger after she died. Meanwhile, Karpis continued to run, and he carried secrets with him. He knew how the gang truly worked. He knew who planned what. He knew who made decisions. He knew how the crew communicated and where the money went. He knew how close Ma truly was to the core planning. If anyone could answer the question about Ma Barker's role, it would be him. But criminals do not always tell the full truth, even when they talk. They protect themselves. They protect their own image. They control what they reveal. And in a story already filled with myth, even a confession can become another version of the legend. In 1936, Karpis's run ended. He was captured in New Orleans. That moment mattered because it closed the largest remaining gap in the government's case. It allowed law enforcement to declare the gang fully broken. It gave the public the final capture it had been waiting for. For Karpis, it meant the end of movement and the beginning of confinement. The man who had lived by controlling every detail now faced a system he could not control. When Karpis was finally behind bars, the Barker Karpis gang became a completed story in the public mind. A beginning, a rise, a series of terrifying crimes, a violent end. But even with Karpis captured, the argument about Ma Barker did not disappear. It grew more complicated, because now people had time to look back. They had time to compare sources. They had time to study contradictions. and contradictions were everywhere. Some reports described Ma as a decisive criminal leader. Others described her as present but not central. Some claimed she wrote plans. Others claimed she could barely keep up with the life around her. Some presented her as a symbol of evil. Others presented her as a tragic figure who stayed too close to her sons and paid the ultimate price. Why did the contradictions exist? Because crime stories are often shaped by fear, by politics, and by public hunger for drama. In the 1930s, the FBI was also building its reputation. Public victories mattered. Strong villains made the victories look bigger, and Ma Barker, mastermind mother, was a villain the public could not forget. But historical truth does not always match what people want to remember. Sometimes truth is messy. Sometimes it has no clean hero. Sometimes it is only broken people making bad choices, and a society turning those choices into a story that fits its emotions. Karpis' capture did not answer all questions. It only ended the chase. And that is why the Ma Barker story is still powerful today. It is not just a crime story. It is also a story about myth-making. When Alvin Creepy Karpis was finally captured, the chase was over. The Barker Karpis gang was broken. The kidnappings, robberies, and hiding places were now part of history. The people who survived were in prison, and the people who did not survive were gone. But even after the gang ended, one thing did not end out the story. Because the story was never only about crime, it was about a name that grew larger than the real person behind it. It was about how fear can create a legend. And it was about how the public can repeat a version of events until that version becomes truth in people's minds. That name was Ma Barker. By the time the last headlines faded, Ma Barker had become a symbol. Too many people. She was not Kate Barker anymore. She was Ma, the gangster mother, the alleged mastermind, the woman who raised criminals and supposedly led them. It was a powerful image, and it was easy to remember. But the final truth is more complicated. Ma Barker was real. The crimes were real. The gang was real. The kidnappings were real. The kidnappings were real. People suffered because of what the gang did. Families paid ransoms. Communities lived in fear. And the gang's violence was not a myth. The question was never whether the crimes happened. The question was this: what was Ma Barker's true role? Some stories describe her as the brain behind the operation. In those stories, Ma is not just present. She is commanding. She is planning. She is giving orders. She is the one the men listen to. That version of Ma Barker is almost like a criminal queen, a rare and shocking figure in the 1930s. But other researchers and historians argue that this version was exaggerated. They point out that the Barker Karpis gang had strong male leaders who were fully capable of planning and violence, especially Alvin Karpis, who was known for careful thinking and strategy. They also note that the gang's actions often looked like the decisions of men under pressure, not like the careful work of a single hidden genius. They also highlight something important. In many crime stories, the public prefers a simple villain, and Ma Barker made the story simple. A mother leading criminals is a headline that grips people. It feels shocking. It feels unnatural. It makes a reader stop and look. It also makes law enforcement victories look even bigger. If the villain is famous and terrifying, the victory feels more powerful. So the legend grew, and once the legend grows, it becomes hard to shrink it back down. That is why Ma Barker's story still sparks debate. It sits right at the line between history and mythology. Even today, people argue about whether she was truly the mastermind or mainly a mother who stayed close to her sons. The most honest conclusion is this: Ma Barker was deeply connected to the gang's world, but the evidence for her being the main planner is not clear in a way that ends all debate. She traveled with criminals. She lived in their hiding places. She stayed near them while they ran. She benefited from being close to the gang, even if only through survival and shelter. That alone ties her to the crime. A person does not have to hold a gun to be part of a criminal life. But being close to criminals is not the same thing as being the commander of criminals. This is where the emotional truth of the story becomes important. Because whether Ma was a mastermind or not, her life still shows something real and painful. How family loyalty can turn into a trap. Many people want to believe they would walk away from a child who becomes dangerous, but real life is not always like that. Parents can deny reality. Parents can hope things will change. Parents can stay too long because leaving feels impossible. That does not excuse crime, but it explains how a person can become part of a terrible story without being the person who designed it. And in Ma Barker's case, her final moments deepen. The tragedy that she did not die in a courtroom, defending herself. She did not die with a clear confession. She died in a small house in Florida, surrounded by federal agents, trapped in a violent standoff that lasted 4 hours. When the gunfight ended, Ma and Fred were dead. And once Ma was dead, she could no longer shape her own story. That is when her legend became fully owned by others. Newspapers could describe her any way they wanted. Officials could present her any way they wanted. The public could imagine her any way it wanted. And the truth, whatever the full truth was, became harder to protect. So what is the final message of this biography? It is not that Ma Barker was innocent. It is not that she was purely a victim. It is not that she was purely a mastermind either. It is that Ma Barker became one of America's most famous crime figures because she stood at a perfect crossroads of fear and fascination. A mother, a gang, a nation in crisis, and a story too dramatic for the public to resist. The Barker Karpis Gang rose during the Great Depression, when people were desperate and law enforcement was changing. They used planning, mobility, and intimidation to survive. They committed crimes that shook the country, especially kidnapping wealthy men for ransom. And when the government finally closed in, the end came fast and violent. The gang died as a group, but the myth lived on. That is why Ma Barker remains a name people still search for today. Not only because of the crimes, but because of the question behind the name. How much of what people remember is real? And how much is a story they wanted to believe? In the end, the Ma Barker story is both a true crime biography and a warning about legend-making it shows. What happens when criminals chase power and money without limits? It shows how quickly society can turn fear into a symbol. And it shows how one person can become famous forever. Whether or not the fame matches the full truth, the Barker Karpis era is gone, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is not only the criminal. Sometimes it is the story that gets built after the crime. If this story changed how you see Ma Barker, leave a comment with your opinion. Mastermind or myth made her. Subscribe for more true, real-life biographies. And watch the next video for the full story of Alvin Karpis, last major figure of the gang, who kept running long after the headlines said it was over.